Greetings from Columbia Business School, Executive Education. My name is Scott Gardner, and I'm very happy to be here today with my very good friend, Rita McGrath, for today's webinar, Seeing Around Corners, Leveraging Women's Leadership Skills in a Time of COVID-19. Before I introduce Rita, I'd like to just go over a few quick logistics. If you'll look at the screen, a recording of this webinar will be made available to you. If you'd like to tweet about this webinar, please do so at #CBSExecEd. And finally, most importantly, please submit those questions to the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. It's my pleasure to introduce Rita Gunther McGrath. She is the best-selling author, sought-after speaker, and a longtime faculty member at Columbia Business School. She is widely recognized as a premier expert on leading innovation and growth during times of uncertainty. Rita has received the #1 Achievement Award for Strategy from the prestigious Thinkers 50 and has consistently been named one of the world's top 10 management thinkers in its biannual ranking. Rita is the author of the best-selling book, The End of Competitive Advantage, and the most recent book, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. She received her PhD from the Wharton School and has degrees with honors from Barnard College and the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. She is the faculty director of several of our executive education programs, including the upcoming Women in Leadership program taking place in a live online format this July. Rita, it's great to be with you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Scott. Hi, and hello to all of you out there.
I wish we could be in person, but I'm going to give you the stage now. I will rejoin you on the last 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it. We'll get to those questions. So I'll reiterate with what Scott already said, which is please put those questions in the box. That'll help us with this webinar. It'll also help with designing the course, which we really try to tailor to the participant experience. So when we think about leadership, I'm very taken with this quote from a really good friend of mine, Tom Kolditz, the author of a book called In Extremis Leadership. And he used to teach leadership at West Point. And for fun, he teaches the students at West Point to jump out of airplanes. And he said to me, well, I could take you up on a jump. I'm like, you know, Tom, I love you to death, but that's not what I'm up for right now. But he made an observation about leadership that I think is really apt for this moment that we're all in. And it's as follows. People will put up with awful, terrible, incompetent leadership as long as things are going well. And remember, we've had 10 years or so in the US, at least, of things going pretty well. But when the inevitable crisis occurs, rank and file perspective changes, the focus turns to competence, and the pressure skyrockets. And that's the moment that we're in right now. And I think women and women's leadership have a lot to offer in this particular moment in time. So let me tie this back to the whole theme of seeing around corners, because I think it's very apt. So Seeing Around Corners, the book, it has to do with strategic inflection points. And a strategic inflection point is something that changes the rules of the game as they had been written. So if you think about any sector, any activity that you might be engaged in, it's grown up over time with a certain set of taken for granted metrics and performance indicators and drivers of success, all based on what we learned from the past. And I think it's very valuable to remember that when an inflection point, and we're in the midst of one right now, passes through, a lot of those things that we just take for granted as being true from the past change. So the rules change. And the question is, how do you see them coming? How do you see what's changed? How do you decide what to do about it? And then how do you bring the organization with you? And in each of those stages of an inflection point, there's a real need for leaders to drive each of those sort of phases. And so what we're going to think about is COVID-19 as an inflection point we're all navigating through, and what do women specifically have to offer in this moment that might be worth thinking about. And so a lot of the research that I'm going to be referring to refers to the work of many people who've studied women's leaderships, Sally Helgeson, Aviva Wittenberg-Cox, and many of the faculty who are going to be in our program. So people like Deborah Riegel, Giselle Shelley, Jane Prager, and others who have really contributed their expertise to this kind of exposition of what women as leaders can do. So what do we do? What do we do now? We're in the midst of this inflection point. We're at this particular moment, which is June of 2020. We're sort of past the first shock waves. We're in our third or fourth month of sheltering in place, and some of us have kids at home, some of us have other responsibilities. There's an awful lot going on. How do we make sense of what we do now? And the first observation I would make is, we're really in this moment where we need to absorb a lot of information. And what women, I think, are particularly good at is getting out to the edges of a situation. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. So the original work on strategic inflection points was published by Andy Grove in a fabulous book that came out in the 90s called Only the Paranoid Survive. And in that book, he makes the observation that if you want to know where spring is first making itself felt, you must travel to the periphery, for that's where the snow is most exposed. And the way that I frame that is snow melts from the edges. And what I talk about is leaders need to be able to get out to the edges of their organizations, because the news that's important is not presenting itself neatly at the conference table at corporate headquarters, right? So it's things like making sure that you're personally present where things are happening, making sure that you build lines of communication to people who are actually exposed to the phenomena. Because, by the time you get up to the top of most large organizations, the ability to distill the information is it's so packaged and it's in PowerPoints and it's so digested, it's kind of lost its meaning. And so what you want to be doing is thinking about, how do I build diverse teams so that I have different perspectives looking on a problem? Is that person on the loading dock who's perhaps seeing something really important able to come in and share that? Right. And so things like, how do we get horizontal communications? How do we break down silos? Absolutely critical in my research to going through an inflection point. So what we're going to talk about a little bit is women's leadership in that context. So I think the first question, and this was posted in Forbes a couple of weeks back, which is, what do the countries with the best coronavirus responses have in common? And in a lot of cases, it's women leaders. And if you think about the countries that are frankly doing a terrible job at dealing with this pandemic, almost all of them are led by men. And I would argue this is not an accident. And I could have had another slide with women from Africa and South America, and all over. These happen to be mostly European. But you could have had a lot of different women leaders all over the country. And what I would suggest is that what they have done is they've calmly stated what the problem is. They've been very transparent about, here's what science tells us, here's what the experts tell us, here's what I think is happening. They've built trust among their population. They've given everybody a calm and consistent message, right? And then they've laid out a course of action that the bulk of the populations of the countries where they're in have been willing to go along with. So even though it might involve sacrifice, what they've done is made the case, right? And they've included people in the conversation. So I would argue this isn't an accident, and it is just a very recent and vivid example of how women leaders are able to bring along large groups of other people in what they're trying to accomplish. So here's the basic idea. When the situation requires creativity, cooperation, and devolved decision-making, so that you can have the people that are closest to the phenomenon actually able to give their input into what's going on, women's ways of leading have an advantage that's been sort of statistically shown. So an interesting book that talks about this, even though these were men largely that were involved, but the practice is the same, was Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. And what he talked about was that in order to marshal a response on the ground in the face of an enemy that was constantly changing shape, right? We needed to have these ways of communicating, ways of working that broke down the hierarchy, that devolved responsibility, and let the person who was closest to what was going on actually make the critical decisions. And one of the things that they put in place in his work was a phone call that happened daily. And everybody who had relevant information was on that call and was able to just share what they're seeing, what's going on, so that the entity, the whole, has much more of a collective consciousness. And we see this a lot. In fact, my dear friend and colleague, Linda Hill, wrote a fabulous book called Collective Genius about how these leaders manage to create webs of inclusion that really carry information across. So what specifically are the behaviors that we're looking at? So I think the first one is what we tend to see is this calmness among many of the women leaders. They create trust. They create a sense of purpose. But as my buddy Tom would say, what they do is they bring down the emotional temperature. When you're in a crisis, when you're in a moment where everything is going crazy around you, you don't need people adding fire to the flame. What you need is somebody calming things down and saying, here's what I see, being very transparent, building that trust. So I'm prepared to make a sacrifice. You should be prepared to do so as well. And I think the Prime Minister of New Zealand is just fascinating with the way that she's in sweatpants with her baby, communicating to her people. I'm not free from this situation. I'm not, sitting in my yacht or whatever. I'm part of the situation. That's the first thing. Focus is the second element that we find these leaders doing very, very well. So they're saying, look, we're going to focus on the task and the environment. In other words, take the focus off yourselves. Here are the most important things we can each be doing to help improve the situation in a crisis. Here are some of the things that we can get you focused on. What you want is to get people past their emotion to a point where they can actually prepare to take action and go next. So that's the next thing. I think being open to taking risks, this sense of shared vulnerability. So back to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, there she is, she's in her living room. It's not perfect. It doesn't look like a, Instagram poster. It's a shared risk, a sense of vulnerability. And that the sense that we're in this together. We're in this together. I'm not apart from you, right? And we can all think of, I'm sure, examples of several male leaders who have not taken that position where they said, well, the rules are for you, but I'm exempt, in some way. So it just breaks down trust, right? I mean, how could you trust someone who says one thing and does completely another, or says, well, you should be following the rules and I don't need to be bothering with that. And I won't call out anybody specifically, but there've been some horrible recent examples of this kind of behavior on the part of leaders. And it's not productive. It just breaks down trust and creates a lot of fractioning. I think for women leaders, one factor that tends to be very much associated with them is this sense of the personal, that I can be with you, I can share my insights, we can talk together about what we're having, but it's personal, we're relatable. You're not just some icon up there mouthing from a teleprompter, you're actually using your own words, you're being relatable, and people can get into that. And then finally, there's a sense of competence, right? So if I look at Angela Merkel from Germany, I mean, this is a trained scientist. She understands science. People know that's her background. And she almost, you listen to her press conferences and she's explaining to people, what does it mean to have a disease under control? And a big factor in what it means is how many people are infected by one person and what's the rate of transmission. And just really shares that in a very explainable, easy to understand way so that people kind of get it. And by and large, she's had tremendous support from the German people. Her popularity is through the roof, even though she's not going to be running again for another term. But I think that's a nice example of this, just calm, quiet display of competence, right? These are the facts, these are the data. I'm going to share with you what I know. And I'll also, by the way, be open to telling you what I don't know. And what we have to find out. And, she's very transparent about that. So one of the things you'll see is not claiming to know the answers, before you really do know the answers. And then lastly, I think these women are very strategic in what they're doing. They have a very clear picture of the outcome that they're trying to drive and kind of work backward into what does that outcome require behavior to be today. And I think that's a very strategic way of looking at something like a public health crisis. So what ties all this together is what my friend Sally Helgeson calls webs of inclusion, that for a lot of these women, they're leading in a very different way. They're not leading by telling people what to do, because that's deadly in a situation where what you really need is people being willing to give their input, share their ideas, be open to input from, it could be the lowest level person on the hierarchy who has the key to the answer to this problem. And so this is another factor that I think women tend to be pretty good at, which is creating environments that are psychologically safe. So this is some work that was done by a really good friend of mine, Amy Edmondson, back in the 90s. And she was working and looking at medical errors in hospitals and had this anomaly come up in her research, which really, really puzzled her, but has actually led to some major breakthroughs since. And here's what she found. She found that the teams in hospitals that were regarded as high-performing teams on an objective measure that someone else collected, so these high-performing teams had more medical errors than teams that were regarded as lower performing. And she just was, baffled by this. But it turns out that it's actually a factor of how the data were collected. It turns out the teams that were high performing, in other words, that felt comfortable raising issues and felt comfortable sort of saying to people, I think that medical chart, the last 3 times you did this, you called for this particular medication. Was there a reason you left it out this time? Teams that could have those kind of conversations were actually far more comfortable reporting medical errors than the teams that weren't. And her research since, which has spanned a couple of decades now, shows just how critically important this notion of psychological safety is, our ability to bring up uncomfortable information or bring up disconfirming information and have it be received and acted on in a productive way. And she's just got many, many examples of how critical this is. And again, I would say what we're seeing from an awful lot of men is not conditions that would create psychological safety, right? And you can see it right now with all the debate about should you wear a mask or not. Well, the science is pretty clear on it, but many people have allowed it to become kind of a talking point or a political issue. It's a scientific issue. It's one of the few ways that we can really help slow, again, that number of transmissions per person. It's not. The virus doesn't care what party you are or what politics you have. So it's this idea of can we create a safe space in which to have these conversations? And if someone doesn't want to wear a mask, let's understand why, but let's not turn it into this argument, which is not particularly productive. So what ties it all together, as I said, these webs of inclusion where people get inputs from many different sources and are able to create that strategy going forward. So what we do in the course in Women in Leadership is we really try to help people uncover their strengths, refine their vision. So try to build on that whole picture I just showed you, that which is really reflective of what we do in the course. We talk about giving and getting feedback, absolutely critical. But if you don't have psychological safety, very hard to give or get feedback. We talk about telling stories. That's what brings these ideas to life, right? How do you craft a story? How do you strategically use storytelling in your work? We talk about vulnerability. What makes you feel vulnerable? And a lot of times it might be something like that imposter syndrome, feeling like, I shouldn't really be here. And we'll talk about networks and how you can build these webs of inclusion, how you decide who's in your network, who do you need in your network, where does your network have gaps that you really need to focus on. And the whole goal really is to create the conditions under which women can get more power in their organizations. And the reason I think that's so important is when women have power, they have the right to influence decisions. They have the right to be heard by others. They have the right to change the trajectory that the organization is on. And so it's great to be inclusive and all that, but if you don't have power in your organization, the organization is not going to benefit from the things that women have to give and women have to offer. So let me wrap up with a couple of thoughts. I think leadership matters just incredibly when things are going badly, as Tom Kolditz pointed out. That's what we're looking for now. We need creativity. We need cooperation. This is a situation none of us have ever seen before. So the only way we're going to come out to a good place on the other end is by using our creativity, by using our cooperation. The edges really matter. You really need to get out to the edges and see what's going on out there and understand how you can make an impact on that. Webs are performing a lot better than hierarchies. Webs are faster. Webs communicate more readily. Webs involve more people. Webs can get more people engaged. And I think that's what you're really seeing. Trust, huge. I think just a huge issue. And certainly I'm living in a country right now where there's not a lot of trust. The trust has kind of been eroded. And as a consequence, we're not acting in a unified way. We don't trust the information we're being given. We don't trust each other. And I think that's a huge gap, a huge trust deficit, which is, you can just look at the data. It's hindering our having an effective response to this historical challenge that we're facing. And finally, I would leave you with this thought that women, whether by socialization or whatever, have a lot of understanding of what is needed right now. And I think the more that we can leverage that powerfully, the better. So let me wrap up with some additional resources if you'd like to do a deeper dive. There's my email. I'm easily reachable at columbia.edu. I'm on Twitter at RG McGrath. I'm on LinkedIn. I actually have a YouTube channel. Everybody's got to have a YouTube channel now, so I've got one of those. I do a monthly newsletter. It's free. You can just go to my website and sign up. This month's, the June newsletter is going to be about teamwork and how do you build effective teams. And I'll give a diagnostic and some ways of thinking about building effective teams. The other thing I'm doing is every Friday, I do a Friday fireside chat. Again, free. Go to my website. This log will tell you what the upcoming ones are. And I'm very excited that I've got some fabulous female leaders and thinkers and writers coming up, as well as men too. We don't discriminate there. So with that, Scott, let me invite you back onto the stage, as it were, and we can move to the Q&A part.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rita. Wonderful information. And we have a lot of great questions that came in. So are we ready for those?
Totally. Let's do it.
Great. So the first one kicked off, and I think this is very important. Talia asked, as a leader, as a woman leader in position of leadership, how do you help other women leaders in the time of a crisis?
That's fantastic. I think bringing them into conversations is the first. So, as I said, the gem of that idea that may rescue you in a situation like this may be in a junior person way down the hierarchy somewhere. So I think creating the context in which people can come in and participate. So something our dean at Columbia has been doing, which I think is really interesting, is having just listening sessions. And anybody in the organization that wants a spot on the agenda can ask for, a minute or two to ask a question, give an opinion, give their voice. So those kinds of things, I think, really open up the participation to other people. More specifically, I think if you can identify women who are likely to be at a critical juncture, so they're at the forefront of the science, or they're at the forefront of the crisis, or they're managing employees who, are being asked to possibly put themselves in danger and don't want to. But making a point of giving them the time that you can listen to what's going on, I think that's super useful. And then helping women connect to each other. And in the Women in Leadership course, we talk a lot about this in the networking part. And just to presage a little bit, what women tend to do is they build these very dense, very trusting networks that get stuff done. Right? What they're not spending as much time on in many cases is those broader networks where you could pick up a vital piece of information, or, hey, do you know anybody who knows anything about, selenium chemistry? Whatever your question is, that you're more likely to get that if you have a broader network. So we'll really focus in on how you can think about that in the course.
Rita, are there any tools out there that you could suggest that help with that broader connection? In other words, platforms or groups or whatever that would help because somebody may say, well, that's a great idea, but what do I do?
Right. So a couple of things. So we are using a tool in the course. It's called the Gleam instrument. And basically it allows you to do a network assessment. And the other sets of tools that we use, so back to Gleam. So what Gleam will do is it'll give you a picture of what your network looks like. Is it a big expansive network, or is it really dense and narrow? So let's say you said, I really need to expand my network. Well, here's where I would borrow a little bit from William Henry Gibson. He's a science fiction writer. And he's very famous for having said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And my recommendation on that is go to places where the future is starting to make itself felt. And don't be afraid to sort of dip in. So if you're on LinkedIn, maybe there are some interest groups talking about something that it hasn't been part of your wheelhouse yet, but you think it might need to be, right? So I do this actually a lot. I dip in on groups that are just, not necessarily groups I know much about, but so for example, groups that are associated with the arts. And I think the arts have a lot to teach us in these moments of human shift and change and fear. And I don't know anything about that world particularly, but I'm spending a lot of time talking to people who do. And it's been very illuminating in terms of, here's the things that we can do that create a positive impact. So go to where the future is starting, get involved with groups that are not necessarily duplicates of something you've been doing for a long time, and think about who might have something relevant to say, even if it's not part of the traditional way that we look at these problems.
Great. Well, okay, on the other side, then a question came in right after that from Sam. How can men develop these behaviors to support this?
Oh, that's a great question. And, I've spent a lot of time in my life in rooms full of women talking to each other. And, at some point, it's not all that helpful. So I'm very open to allies. And what does it mean to be an ally? You can, in a meeting, if somebody interrupts a woman, you can say, wait a minute, whoa, I wanted to hear what Josie had to say. So, micro level, right? So, hey, we haven't heard from Sue. in this meeting, and I think she might have a valuable perspective. So, at a very one-on-one level, just hearing and amplifying women's voices in those kinds of settings. I think that's a very practical thing. You could start doing that the minute you get off this webinar. Second is a little bit more proactive, but set yourself some goals, right? I mean, if you're interviewing for a job, have you interviewed at least 2 or 3 women? Now, here's one of the things people get wrong. If you include just one woman, say in a panel, you've got 6 candidates, let's say, and one of them's a woman, there's actually some research that shows that will tend to make the woman less likely to be getting the offer. And the reason is a psychological factor. She looks like the outlier. If it's just one, right? They look like the outlier, they look like the risky choice, whereas the norm is clearly male. And so, there's a psychological thing that happens in our heads that makes us much more likely to select the man in a situation like that. So you want at least 2 women. Right. 3 is better, but at least 2. So set yourself some goals. When I'm setting up a job interview, I'm going to have at least 2 women, or I'm going to have at least, 3 women, or I'm going to have a person of color, which is, I think, right now. And you can do that yourself. You don't need them up there in the organization to tell you to do that. Like, you could set that up as a personal mantra from now on. And I think the last thing is when you have women who are exceptional in your organization, to create opportunities for them, even if it's not working for you elsewhere. Patty McCord, who's a friend of mine, she was the original founding HR director for Netflix. And she said, increasingly we need to start thinking about organizations as great places to be from. Give me a minute. Great places to be from. So you want to build this sort of cultivation of talent, regardless of where that talent goes. Because, by the way, if you've got this strong network culture, even if they're not working for you anymore, which is kind of a difference from the traditional HR view, right? Which is retain people, keep them. No, I mean, if they're out there in the world seeing things and doing things, and you've got a good relationship, that's such a valuable source of information. Why try to trap them all in one organizational structure? And it requires just a little bit of rethinking. So those are some very specific things men can do.
Oh. Well, and it's interesting, and it kind of feeds into our next question, because I also think generations that are coming up now do not look at their life as staying one place for a long period. So it's sort of, that answers that question in itself. You have to move into that mindset. But Asif asks, what advice would you give to the next generation of female leaders?
I think the first thing is try to get past the behaviors that get in your own way. I mean, that's something that's within your control. So just seemingly trivial things, stop saying you're sorry. You have a right to exist. You have a right to breathe. If you're at that meeting, you have a right to be there. So don't do this sort of squirming. Oh, I'm sorry. Could I just, no, if you've got expertise, if you've got knowledge that is unique, and you will see things in a way that's different from the way everybody else in that room sees them. You have a right to bring that into the conversation. So I think that's one that I would suggest. Secondly is try to think strategically about what are your goals. And one of the very common things I think women leaders get into sometimes is they see the goal in terms of a particular position or hierarchical niche. And so I had this conversation with a young woman who said, my goal is to be the VP of marketing. And that was her goal. And she had it all mapped out, her career strategies for getting to be VP of marketing. And I was like, well, why is it you want to be VP of marketing? And she said, because that way, I can determine creative direction, and I can bring on talented people, and I can, really put my stamp on the way this entity relates to the world. And I said, well, you can achieve those things in many ways. It doesn't have to be because you got promoted to VP of marketing. Because what happens to women a lot is they get into that mindset, they get somewhere in the career path that they've mapped out for themselves, then something stupid happens, or they don't get their project recognized, or some idiotic thing happens, and they either get demotivated or they leave. And instead, what I would say is, that particular thing may be blocked for you, so go around it, find a different way of getting to those goals, but be clear on what the goals are. So one of the things we try to do in Women in Leadership is help people actually reflect on what is it you really want? Like, what is it your real vision is? And a lot of women, if you ask them, what is it you want? They can't tell you. And so we want them to have that answer right on the tip of their tongue.
Yeah. Well, and it's, oh my gosh, you and I, we could talk about this for hours.
Totally.
It's so important. And, it all balances with that, what you talked about with vulnerability and psychological safety and all that. And I think these are also things you talk about in the program. You know what I mean? We're at 12:30 already, but I just have one last quick question. I know, it goes so fast. Maybe, we could ask, what do we look at as like, in the terms of the program, you know, what do you see as like level for that program? Who is this applicable to?
Well, it was designed originally for women who are kind of 10, 15 years in. So that moment in a lot of organizations where we start to see women just falling off the professional trajectory. But what I found in the intervening years that we've been running it, so we run this program in person, is we're actually getting women at many different stages in their careers. And I think the reason is that everybody can benefit from that opportunity to reflect, the opportunity to kind of think about what is it that I really want next? You know, what's my next thing? And the other thing that we've done very successfully is we've partnered. So we have more senior women and they're working on a common problem. We partner them in a group with each other so that they've got women of similar levels of experience. But we also do kind of partnering with the younger women who often see the world in really different ways. And so it's been kind of nice to have that to mix and match with. So we're actually seeing interest across the board.
Well, I've seen this program with you, and it is a much broader range, but also you're basically living the value that you talked about, which is the inclusive experience, inclusive ideas, you know, so it's in that sense of group work in the program, you're mirroring what they should behave like in their own companies.
Yeah, and one of the things I would also say is the 3-day program, the in-person program, is like drinking from a fire hose. I mean, there's just so much information that comes at you. Right. And what I'm excited about with the live online format is you're actually going to get some space in between the sessions to do some homework, to reflect, to absorb it. It's not going to be this kind of massive thing. So I actually think this might prove to be a much more practical, you know, applicable format for a number of people.
Wonderful. Well, Rita, thank you so much.
Thanks.
I wish we could be in person. I miss seeing you, but it's
Me
great
too.
online. And I'm excited for the program next month. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today on behalf of Columbia Business School Executive Education. Rita McGrath, myself, thank you very much. Be safe, be well. Thank you, Rita.
Thanks. Bye.